Now that the Lok Sabha elections results are out and the new NDA government would be assuming its office within the next week, the important question in front of us is that what should be the economic agenda and policy priority for the new government. Indian economy is one of the fastest growing economies of the world. Recently released data from the National Statistics Office estimates that the India's economic growth in the fiscal year 2024 would be somewhere around 8.2%, which is way higher than its projected growth rate for the same fiscal year. And it is even 1.2% higher than the previous fiscal's growth rate. Indian economy's inflation rate is now under control, or which is under the prescribed limit of the policy for the inflation. Despite of all this strength into the economy, there are fundamental and persistent issues with the Indian economy that the new government need to resolve. In this video, I shall be highlighting 5 key areas where the government need to focus for making India a Viksit Bharat by 2047. This list is just indicative in nature and not the exhaustive one. So let's dive deep into understanding what are the 5 key highlighting areas for the Indian government to focus for the economic development. These areas are, first one is about the labor efficiency or increasing the labor efficiency. The second one is about changing the government's spending patterns. Third one is about from going to business readiness from ease of doing business. Fourth one is about India's focus on logistical reforms, and fifth one is about the tax reforms in the economy. Let's look at the labor efficiency. India's labor efficiency is way lower than its Asian counterparts. Different scholars define labor productivity and labor efficiency differently. But for the sake of this explainer, we are taking the internationally accepted definition of the labor productivity by the International Labour Organization, which defines labor productivity as GDP per person employed per hour in US dollar terms. Now, if we look at this particular definition and compare the figures presented by the International Labour Organization, we find that the Indian economy's labor productivity lags behind to its Asian counterparts like Philippines, Indonesia, China, and even Japan. Let's look at some of the figures from the 2015. According to 2015 report from the International Labour Organization, India's labor productivity was 6.46. This is per GDP per person employed per hour in US dollar terms. It was 6.46 in 2015 for India. For the same period, the Asia's highest GDP per person employed was of Japan, that was 36.22. China's labor productivity was 10.64%. Indonesia was at 10.21 and Philippines was 7.55, which is again higher than the India's labor productivity. If we compare the figures of the developed country like the USA, in the same period of 2015, the USA's labor productivity was 59.77%. Now you can see the gap between the two countries, or the developed and developing countries gap in the labor productivity. You may ask that what keeps India way behind into the labor productivity? The answer to this question is very complex in nature, but to begin with, we can identify 4 areas where India lags behind. The first one is about the lower skill level or inadequate skill level of the India's labor. The second one is about infrastructural deficiencies into the Indian economy. Third one is about the suboptimal adaptation of the new technologies and mechanisms. And fourth one is about the complexities of the labor laws. Now, all in all, we can say that the labor productivity is a function of laborers' skill, optimum use of machinery and technology, along with the adequate level of the wage, that is the remunerative wage system into the economy. Another issue with the labor productivity or labor efficiency in India is about the jobless growth. Now consider a figure. The labor productivity is purely a statistic. if you look at the formula, you will see that the GDP contributed by the per person employed. It means that if people are not employed or underemployed, the labor productivity is going to hamper. Now, the jobless growth of India, which is a result of the unemployment and underemployment, it affects the labor productivity negatively. According to recently released data from the periodic labor force survey, the government is estimating that around 1 million people join workforce in India. Now, these people are wanting to have the employment, but due to the prevailing conditions into the economy, not getting the remunerative employment. Another thing is that for this, the lopsidedness of the job creation into the economy affects the Indian economy such that it lags behind in achieving the overall target of workforce efficiency. Now, to take the full advantage of India's newly adding workforce, we will need to look at the labor laws which complements the present economic milieu. That is, we'll have to bring these labor laws into sync with the present economic conditions, such as we will have to think about the gig workers, we'll have to provide them the social securities and all. Now, to solve these persistent problems related to the labor force efficiency, the government has brought in 4 labor codes in the year of 2019 and 20. The government has codified all the different labor laws into the 4 codes, but the notification of those labor codes yet is happened. That is, the notification of those labor codes have never happened into the economy, even though the previous government had 4 years to notify them. Now, the new coming government will have to implement these labor codes with the utmost priority. For this, they will have to convince the state government as well, so that they can do away with the rigidity of the labor related affairs from the economy. Now, to go one step further, the labor codes need to be tweaked. The codified labor codes are supposed to be tweaked in such a manner that it enhances the labor productivity and makes employment generation more lucrative for the job givers. For this, the government can provide the tax reliefs to the job givers into the economy. The code, even these presently passed codes which are yet to be notified, even needs to streamline some of the labor related affairs, and they need to simplify some of the things. These things include easing of the industrial relations. In present codes as well, the industrial relations is not eased out. Another thing is to ensure the universal and fair wages. The economy, unless and until there is the universal and fair wages into the economy, it will not create the remunerative employment. So the government need to provide these universal and fair wages to the people. Another one is to provide the workplace safety to all the workers. Now, this includes the gig workers as well. And along with the workplace safety, the government need to think about providing the overall social security to these new aged employment areas, such as the gig worker, as I earlier mentioned. Now, the government, apart from the labor laws, what the government can do is to give or enhance or reform the education system in such a manner that it makes the vocational training and practical skill development at the counter stage. Currently, what is happening is the curriculum of the academia and actual industrial needs have the huge gap in between. So, to do away with this gap, the government is supposed to make the skill development, vocational skill development and practical skill development a counter stage into the overall skill development or education policy. The second area where the government needs to look into is the reforming its spending patterns. Now, what we mean by this? Currently, the government engages into providing subsidies to the people. Now, the subsidies per se are not bad for the economy, but what they do is they affect the economy sometimes negatively. Consider the figure of India. India's total subsidy quantum, out of the total subsidy quantum of India, around 98% of subsidy goes into the food and fertilizer subsidy. Now the problem with this thing is that even though India is having poor population in its demography, the issue with this subsidy is that it is not having any subset clause, nor does it have any evaluation criteria where the people who have benefited from the subsidy now can no longer get it. So such type of evaluation criteria is also not there. Now what does this do wrong to the economy? So such type of subsidy without any sunset clause or without any criteria for the evaluation hampers the overall development of the economy. Now you may ask that how come it hampers the development? The answer to is very simple. For providing the subsidy, the government need to look for the fiscal resources. The government need to engage into the debt taking. This affects the government's overall debt to GDP ratio. Moreover, it leaves very little space for the government to invest into the capital expenditure. Now let me explain you this thing from one example. The government is providing free ration to people since the time of pandemic under the PM Garib Kalyan Yojana, which is largely under the National Food Security Act. Now according to the Food Security Act, around 800 million people are getting the free ration from the government. But this figure is contradictory from the government's own point of view, because recently released multidimensional poverty report states that around 135 million people have come out of the poverty. Now look at the contradiction into the government. If government is saying that the 135 million people have come out of the poverty, then they need to be come out of the National Food Security Act. If we are providing ration to these people without any evaluation criteria, it will create a mess. Another thing that the government need to look into is that the fertilizer subsidies. If you look at the fertilizer subsidy, the government provides the general fertilizer subsidy where there is no criteria. Anyone can go and anyone can take the advantage of that because the fertilizers are subsidized at the source only. Now what this results into is that the overuse and misuse of the fertilizers is there, and ultimately the needy farmers get very little opportunity to utilize them. So instead of providing this in general subsidy to the fertilizers, what government can do is to give the cash based subsidy directly to the farmers who are purchasing the fertilizers or who are in the need of the fertilizers. At the same time, the government can also work out an evaluation criteria for the National Food Security Act. One of the secretaries of the government, Subhash Chandra Garg, have suggested that the government should now shift from below poverty line criteria or the poverty line criteria for providing the food security to a new criteria based upon the nutritional value. He suggests that the government should work out the BMI criteria or body mass index criteria and nutritional security instead of the food security to the people. Now what this will do is it will put the sunset clause on these subsidies. This will further ensure the government's overall fiscal transparency into the economy. The another thing in the spending pattern of the government is that the too much of subsidies from the government side leaves a very little space for the capital expenditure and increases the government's overall debt. Now, if we look at the figures from the figures for the fiscal year 2025, the government has provisioned for 11.9 trillion rupees for only servicing the debt. And this debt is not used for the any infrastructural expansion or any of the capital expenditure. It is purely going into the providing subsidies. So this affects the health of the government negatively. The government's debt to GDP ratio currently is at around 57.1%, which is not a good debt to GDP ratio. The government needs to bring down this debt to GDP ratio to around the global standard. Another aspect related to the changing spending patterns includes moving from the cash-based accounting to the accrual-based accounting, where the purchases are accounted if and when it is made instead of if and when it is paid. So this will give the greater or fairer idea about the government's overall liabilities and its assets. Another thing is that the government has saved around 3.5 trillion rupees by the way of the direct benefit transfers, as DBT has resulted into the reduction in overall leakages from the government's expenditure. Now government need to replicate this DBT model into the other subsidies as well and other social sector initiatives where the government can save so much of the